Please tell me a bit about yourself.
Yes, my name's Charis. I've got dyslexia, dyspraxia, and autism. I'm 26 years old. I'm married. I fence sabre competitively for fun. I do historical reenactment. I write history articles and I write articles on disabilities as well. I try to advocate for the neurodiverse community in any way I can. I particularly do a lot of work for dyspraxia. It's a condition that most people haven't heard of.
And so, can you tell me a bit more about yourself? As you told me, you got dyslexia, dyspraxia, and autism. Even though, as I said, a lot of the things you talk about in whichever means we are able to talk about are focusing on dyspraxia. So, can you just hone in on like the whole different neurodivergence you have and how does that affect you?
I wasn't diagnosed until I was 18. I don't have an autism diagnosis because systems to get your diagnosis aren't really made for women. So I've decided, at least for now, that I'm not going to go down that route. I was 18 when I got my dyslexia dyspraxia diagnosis. A doctor told my mom when I was about 6, but it wasn't like on the record or anything. So I was
So,
at university when I got my diagnosis, and that was all because the head of sixth form who taught me psychology and the history teacher who taught me Russian, he was one of the SEN teachers as well. They helped me to get it.
and so when you were saying about when you were 6 years old, that the doctor told your mother, but that wasn't a formal diagnosis.
We were at a party essentially, and he said to my mother, "Oh, I think she might be dyspraxic," but he didn't follow up with anything. My mom says, "What can I do about that?" And he just said, "Make sure that she does things with coordination, even though it will be difficult for her." But he didn't say to her, "Oh, here's where you can get some help."
So how did that feel that it took you from being suspected being at 6 and to being diagnosed at 18? How did that feel of having so many years or 12 years of your life where you could have known and could have had support, but you were without?
My mum didn't tell me until I was 15, so that would make it more probably about 3 years. Obviously, it is difficult because, as most neurodivergent people will say, even before you get your diagnosis, you know that you're different to other people and you want to know why.
And
When I got my diagnosis at 18, I went in asking for a dyslexia dyspraxia diagnosis. I got a dyslexia dyspraxia diagnosis. So I wasn't really shocked at all.
And what was it were the things that you noticed before you have a diagnosis? Or what was it like
Um,
then? Notice what you noticed from your young
I
years?
didn't I didn't know my lefts or my rights. So my mum used to paint my hands different colours, the nails. I couldn't tell the time. It took me a long time to learn to tie my shoes. It took me a long time to ride my bike. And one day I just managed to get it because I was sick of my cousins leaving me behind effectively. I didn't actually tell the time properly until this year because I went to the dyslexia show and I ended up getting one of their watches, which is actually for children, but I found it quite useful.
Yeah, I'll just cross back on to dyslexia in a few moments
Yeah.
shortly, but I want to go back to that feeling of when you was 15, you knew that you could be dyspraxic or you are
Well,
dyspraxic, but you weren't diagnosed then. So what was it within those few years of finding out to actually getting a diagnosis? So in that space of time, what were the things that happened to led you to getting that diagnosis and learning more about yourself?
my mum told me when I was 15, I got into a car with her after a party and I said to her, the other children, young people, because they're not being very nice to me. Like when I dance, they laugh at me. And that's when she decided, she says, that's because you're dyspraxic. And I said, I don't know what that means. And she explained it to me. I don't think it was really till I was probably 22 that I decided it really that I wanted to meet my people, if you like.
Yeah,
So I joined the Dyspraxia Foundation in 2020. Nobody tells you the Dyspraxia Foundation exists. Obviously, it doesn't now. It closed
yeah.
in April. But I found it because I was bored in COVID, as most people are, searching on the internet, found it, decided to give it a go. In 2021, I became a youth champion, and I was a youth champion until the day they closed, so that's just under 2 years. And I won the Matthew Hunt Award from the Dyspraxia Foundation for services to the dyspraxic community under the age of 25, and that was in 2021. And that year I wrote an article called "We Are Dyspraxic and We Are Sick of Judgment" for Red Brick newspaper while I was studying for my master's degree at University of Birmingham. That article was actually shortlisted by the Student Publication Awards for best comment piece, but unfortunately it didn't win. But see, the community says that we're glad I wrote it, and it wasn't just about me, it was about me and probably about 10 other people who told me their story. And they says at least obviously it got out and more people would understand it. And then after my master's degree, I took a little bit of a break because it was a lot when I was doing my master's degree. Yeah. And then this year I decided, late last year, that I wanted to get back into it. So I opened a social group for adults with dyspraxia in the West Midlands with the Dyspraxia Foundation, but obviously that's closed. I am looking to continue it, and I'm looking at ways that will be possible. I was in line to be the first ever editor for the Dyspraxia Foundation, but obviously that didn't work out either. But since the closure of the foundation, I've gone on to a couple of other avenues. So I joined the Dyspraxia Collective with the 7 of us who are hopefully going to create like a community where people can get resources so that dyspraxia isn't obviously just kicked under the bed, if you like, and forgotten about. When I joined another community as a Facebook admin as well. So I'm hoping that obviously all of them will mean that dyspraxia is not forgotten. Obviously, answer your question about how did I feel? I was looking for an answer. I got the answer. But when you're diagnosed at university, on the one hand, I'm really thankful for it because a dyspraxia diagnosis as an adult is virtually impossible because it's not free and doctors won't refer you for it. But because I got diagnosed by Nottingham Trent University, it was entirely free for me. So I can't fault them there at all. I went to a specialist and I didn't really like her very much. You know, when they make you sit down with those questionnaires and you put yes, no, sometimes, always.
It's something that I was diagnosed at some age when you were told we could be diagnosed. I could be dyspraxic when, like, I was around the age of 6 or 7 when I got diagnosed at some age when, like, obviously your doctor said that some sort of party that you was attending tumor. But as you were saying about the forms and sets on the questionnaires, then something that I wouldn't really remember, especially that it might have been something more my teachers or my mother would have been filling out those forms. What was, so I want to get also an understanding of what was it like pushing for diagnosis when you were in university, and also what was that diagnosis assessment like? And why it tells.
I'll go back to sixth form because it is part of it. I was massively struggling to do my A-levels and I ended up with 3 Ds. And my psychology teacher, who was also the head of sixth form, and one of my history teachers who taught me Russian, but he's also one of the SEN teachers, noticed that my handwriting wasn't quite right. And so they referred me to a specialist, but the specialist doesn't say what's wrong with you. It's black or white, this test. Yes, you're in the percent where something's wrong with you. No, you're not. The reason I took this test is because they wanted me to type my exams because they thought it would be better for me. Then I went to see on results when I'd have been 17. I went to the results day for my A-levels, and the Russian teacher, Mr. Halligan, he came up to me and he said, "You're dyslexic. I just don't have it in my power to prove it." So he wrote me a letter to that effect saying I had to get this in support, I believe. I then went to Nottingham Trent University Disability Support, went back and forth for about 2 months saying, "Test me for dyslexia, send us your proof. Test us for dyslexia, send us your proof," until they finally understood I didn't have any proof, I wanted them to test. But obviously tests are rather expensive, so it's because of this letter and because of his help basically that I got to be tested. Because tests are over £1,000 a person, they're not just going to give them out. Then I went to a specialist who I didn't like. And as I said, they give you those questionnaires. You'll have done them, if you haven't done them for this, you'll have done them for something else, where it says never, sometimes, always. And I didn't like those. It was things like, do you struggle with telling the time, for example? Are you in? I didn't like that. If you want to know something funny, I was actually late to that, incredibly late, because I was lost. Yeah, then I went to see the educational psychologist, and they give you a really thick report and tell you what's wrong with you, essentially. So I did things like coordination skills, where they give you a picture, give you some blocks, and say build that. And what the report says is below average in this, for example, above average in that. It breaks down your skills. It's quite thick. At the end of it, much to my husband finds this very funny, at the end of it is a list of recommended reading books. And he's dyslexic with a reading list. That's funny. Yeah, and the verdict was dyslexia with motor neuron and dyspraxic tendencies, which was obviously good because then I could get the support I wanted. I said no to a lot of it because the problem is they don't make the support for you. They say you have dyspraxia, for example, that fits in this box. This is the support you get. So I didn't get a computer because my dad had given me one. They said I could have the ability to record lectures because you're not normally allowed because it's intellectual property, but I would have to pay for the equipment, so I didn't bother. The biggest thing I wanted effectively was, at this point, everybody types their exams. Nobody handwrites university exams. But the biggest thing I really wanted was extra time on my coursework, otherwise I wouldn't have been passing anything, which I got. I also got extra time with the library books. But the problem is when you're diagnosed by a university, they view it as the end of the story. So as I said, nobody told me there was a foundation I could get help with. Because they say, you got what you wanted, off you go now. Whereas it's not, even though I knew what I wanted, I knew that I wanted that diagnosis. So I wasn't just thrust into it. I still didn't really know what it meant, and nobody was there to tell me.
Because I think when you're at university, a lot of the support after a university diagnosis will either be for like looking at what you could get maybe as like support from, like in terms of like your lessons and the academic side of things, and any like existing groups that may or not be on certain universities, because maybe like I know for certain universities they got a lot more groups for autistic people to socialize with, and but I know it's not like that for other neurodivergent conditions, but
I probably wouldn't have gone to say a dyspraxic group or a dyslexic group, or autism wasn't even on the cards at this point. That was up later. But because I didn't particularly want to know, that didn't really come about till I was 22, 20. But obviously, as I said, you get given a diagnosis and left to it. There were a couple of people, Martin Bennett, who I absolutely owe my bachelor's degree in history to, because I misunderstood when my assignment was due in, and I went to him, emailed him in absolute tears, and he gave me 2 extra weeks to do this piece and didn't cap it to a third, which is normal practice. It's late, it gets capped. I went to him later and said to him, thank you so much. And he said, it's all right. If someone hadn't done similar for me, I wouldn't be a professor. But not everybody would do that, because there were other lecturers. There was a lecturer who wouldn't talk to me unless I emailed him with correct grammar and spelling. I can't do that.
Yeah, and it's one of those particular barriers for neurodivergent people. Well, as you said, when you were going through the university after post-diagnosis, when you were like going through the system of applying for extra support, you said some of the support was irrelevant for you.
For example, they can assign you a tutor. What this tutor does is they will go through your work and look over it for you. But the problem is the tutor doesn't understand your subject. What they're mainly looking at is the spelling and grammar and things like that. So I said, no, I'm not interested. Because history is finicky. You have to do it a certain way. So I struggled a bit with referencing, but they wouldn't have been able to help me there because they didn't know a thing about history. So I said, no, I'm not interested.
It's the issue of lack of tailor support, because I guess some of the people could more there to proofread or just maybe help you more with the skills of doing extra research or whatever. But as you said, there can be that issue of the lack of tailor support to your subject, etc.
I'm lucky enough to have had a partner, Oscar he's called. We're married, we've been married 3 years. I've been with him since I was 18. We met at university, so I'm lucky enough to basically have always had him, and he would help me a lot. So he would read my work, or he'd help me if I was struggling with anything, really. I used to do archery, but I had to leave partially because I wasn't treated the way I deserved to be, because I was different and people didn't really like that.
As you were, like, going back to when you mentioned about the Dyspraxia Foundation, what was the main interest off, how did you find out about the group? What made you want to
When I was 18, I was basically treating it like a tick box exercise. I wanted an answer because I wanted the results, i.e. extra time on my coursework. Wasn't particularly interested in anything else. It didn't particularly help that I hadn't really met any dyspraxic people. By the time I was 21, 22, I was decided I was interested. So I went online and I was searching for, as I said, my people. And then I came across the Dyspraxia Foundation, found out they had Facebook pages, asked to join them. Claire Cripps at the time was the youth person employed to do the youth work. So she accepted me in. I don't get on with everybody in the community because you have to have something more in common than dyspraxia. But I did make some good friends there, so I'm really good friends with Sam Killip. I've recently made connections with the Black Dyspraxics, obviously that's Toomey. Christabella Shaw as well from the Dyspraxia magazine. Less than a year after being in the foundation, I was a youth champion.
What's the impact and your thoughts on how the dyspraxia have closed down more?
Obviously, it's really bad that it's closed because it was the only charity out there for dyspraxics. But obviously, people like myself, and as I mentioned to me, Crystal, Sophie, the dyspraxic mummy, we are trying to ensure that there is something left for the community so that resources can still be accessed. And obviously, there's half a dozen. I run a couple of them. Facebook communities online. So obviously, I run the Dyspraxia Central, which online is called Dyspraxia Information. And there's loads of other ones, like there's some for adults, for example. So obviously having these communities is important, but the problem is they're not joined up. They're quite fragmented. I came back to do more work though, as I said last year, because I was doing quite a lot and then I dropped it. Now I'm doing even more. So I don't know if you've seen, but obviously the Dyspraxia magazine, so Christabella Shaw, she's doing the dyspraxia event in October, which obviously would have been Dyspraxia Awareness Week. And I'm hopefully going to be speaking at that. I've gone back to writing articles. So I wrote an article for the Dyspraxia magazine that was in their edition last month called I'm Not Lazy. And a lot of people have said, because I'm sure you've heard that, things like, we're all just a bit clumsy, you're just lazy, you don't pay enough attention, and things like that. Mm-hmm. But particularly since the Dyspraxia Foundation closed, I didn't want there to be a void. So anything I've been offered, I put both hands up, if you like, and said yes. So I'm hoping to do some more speaking engagements. This is my second podcast that I've been on. I'm hoping to write some more.
And as you were saying then, it's something that I assume that what inspires you to join this collective, your interest within organising like a joined up service for this dyspraxic community is because, as you said, even though after the time of diagnosis you weren't referred to getting support for the Dyspraxia Foundation, and I know the Dyspraxia Foundation, there was like a postcode lottery for support in terms of there might be local groups for dyspraxics in certain areas of the country whereas in certain other areas they might be miles out from sports groups. So I guess
I opened myself, obviously one in the West Midlands, specifically focusing on social aspect for adults.
Yeah.
So I think most charities, when you're 25, won't help you anymore. They just say, hurrah, out you go. Which isn't really fair because their argument is you've got a handle on it now, but lots of other people would argue, well, we've got new challenges then. You've got your own house, you've got a job, you've got kids possibly. Or maybe you're in a relationship or whatever. Then you need help with a whole different stage of your life. My social group, it doesn't help. I'm not a therapist. I'm not anything like that.
Yeah.
So my group, it's not there to give people all this advice and things like that. It's there for social reasons because I found this myself and I spoke to my friends and they agreed. That group who are 25 plus seem to be rather quite lonely because they're not necessarily meeting people which is why I made the group. So obviously I live in the West Midlands, but I have got people in the East Midlands and I said to them, well, if you want to use it as, a springboard, you're more than welcome to.
And like you said, you not necessarily giving them advice by advice, I guess. You referring to more informed, professional, qualified, certified advice of any type of thing.
Yeah, see, I can tell somebody my experience.
So I was trying to say, go and save and that, there can be that thing of dyspraxic people sometimes be able to, if you're connecting with other people, you might forget some information that if you go into a service with just other professionals or somebody like more qualified in a certain areas, there may be like some tips or hacks or things that like you can draw from your own personal experience.
Oh, I'm
And
more than happy
sometimes
to talk about my experience with
yeah,
literally anybody, but obviously another thing is you signpost people as well to things like the NHS or Mind or the Samaritans or things like that, because there'll
yeah,
be things that I can't really comment on
yeah,
because
especially if it's terms of mental health, but
yeah.
like the support for people and how people refer to post-diagnosis or seeking the diagnosis, like when like after or even well post-diagnosis from the NHS or
Mhm.
whatever. What are the things? What would you like to be seen that could be done to improve things for people after their diagnosis?
Well, obviously, as it says, I run a community and there are various other communities, and I am wanting to essentially make a catalogue of these communities so that people can access all of them, because sometimes you don't need a professional, you just need someone else to say to you, yeah, I'm a bit like that. Because if you've
Yeah.
not met any other dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic people, you will think you're the odd one out, and you're not. So sometimes just meeting 4 or 5 people who are like you, it's a lot better then.
And it's like, how do you feel even for newly diagnosed dyspraxic people, like in terms of with like certain foundations like Dyspraxia Foundation and other conditions like ADHD, dyslexia and autism,
Mhm.
if it were those you're diagnosed with, when you get a diagnosis or talk to anyone from CES or who are able to get these things on listed on the NHS websites, how do you feel that now for dyspraxic people that is harder to find that information? And is there things that you would like to see, particularly the NHS or the government, do to improve specific support for those?
So obviously, as I mentioned, I was diagnosed at
Yeah,
university, and that's the end of the process. Then out you go, off you go.
yeah,
They could do with obviously maybe some leaflets on it, but I'm not really sure who would make them. But they could definitely tell you that there are other people like you out there and where to find them and stuff. But the problem is, obviously, it's not centralized anymore. So hopefully, we
yeah,
can, through efforts of advocates like myself and other people, hopefully we can get it more centralized again. Schools and universities and colleges and stuff, I would say, needs maybe some more training on dyspraxia, because a lot of them, they know about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, not really dyspraxia.
yeah. Do you suspect that you're autistic? Not got official diagnosis, which as is important to talk about self-diagnosis and how that is valid, of course. What are the things that you notice that you are autistic? And how did you come to that judgment knowing that you are autistic?
So back again when I was about 6, the doctor sent out 3 specialists. Didn't really spend any time with me. Just looked at me and went, "She's not autistic," because the problem is when it comes to female autistics or obviously girls who are autistics, the list of autistic characteristics that they look for is masculine. A lot of the things on the list of a girl or a woman would not present that way. So I see there's a gender inequality in the diagnosis of autism, which is the biggest reason I've decided, at least for now, that I'm not going to go down that for diagnosis. But a friend of mine, she got diagnosed earlier in the year, so she said if I change my mind, she's more than happy to support me. She got diagnosed because she was going down that path for her son. But most of my life, people have said, including an ex-friend of mine, her mum worked in a SEN school, would say she's autistic, but originally because autism was presented as a bad thing by society, I'd get very irate about it and say, no, I'm not. When I was about 22, 23, I decided actually that's fine. And I wrote that around then is obviously when I started to write journalistic articles. So I came to terms with the fact I was autistic and then decided to write about it. So I wrote an article called My Struggle to Accept My Autism for a site called Freshered. And that did really well as well, because I shared it in some autistic communities and they said it was a lot of the things they didn't really know how to put into words themselves. And then this year I was a runner-up in the Learning Disability and Autism Leaders list, so I've got a medal from them. Obviously, I've met a lot more autistic people because a tracks like 4 or 5 of my friends have definitely got it. My husband, for example, going through my journey with me, he's starting to add things up and has realised that he's probably got something.
And in terms of your autism, how does your autism affect you?
I'd like new experiences, but I don't at the same time. I like things my way. I try to get a handle on it because my personal viewpoint is that society has to come, let's say, 80% towards us because of obviously reasonable adjustments. But the autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, ADHD person needs to work with society as well, probably about 20%. So sometimes, particularly when I'm tired, I will say things that I shouldn't have said in the first place. I try to work on it and not say it because you can't go around saying things to people all the time.
So what are those type of things that socially are the things that you find difficult, or you find are part of you being autistic, that sometimes you might not say things what you should really say? What are the things are that?
Yeah, sometimes I can be too blunt, but I do try not to be because it's not really.
How else? What does that look like?
Sometimes I might say to somebody, I don't know, this was a good few years ago, but I said to my friend that I didn't think they were very smart, which is not a very nice thing to say. But I do try to think before I speak. But if I'm overworked or tired, or my brain hasn't quite added it up yet, then sometimes I say it, but then I know straight away I should not have said that thing. I also, mainly because I couldn't get a word in when I was younger, but also because of my autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, sometimes, especially if I'm excited, I will speak over people without meaning to. Also, if I like a topic, I will tell people about it regardless of whether they want to know or not.
I guess, as you hinted at, like, socially, sometimes it's some of those things that I guess there's like that internalized ableism that you might have been advocating for. Like, as I said, when you judge people's intelligence negatively, that might be like the internalized ableism, as you might have seemed to experience around struggling to accept your dyspraxia and autism.
My husband and a friend of mine who I've known about 11 years, he says that I'm quite funny sometimes without meaning to, because I will just come up to them and say things and they're like, that's really funny, what did you say that? Jokes without meaning to. I'll say things that are completely not relevant to the conversation. I'll just go to my husband, things like, how do aeroplanes fly? And he just laughs. Because it's nothing to do with the conversation, it's just something I thought.
Yeah, and so what has it been like getting to the path of your personal learning and education about autism and like your neurodivergent conditions? As you said, we've done a lot of writing, but in terms of those moments of internalized ableism, what has helped you learn how to accept your autism and also learn from the other experiences of others?
I've got some autistic friends and stuff, but the biggest pinnacle that made me think, actually, I think it's okay, is I went on a year volunteering apprenticeship scheme with the educational inequality charity City UK. But I was a mentor for a year 7 student with ADHD. And I thought, after spending a year with him, I thought, he's fine and he's happy. With some assistance, he's now absolutely thriving. If he's not bothered, why am I bothered? And that's one of the biggest reasons I decided that I wasn't really. But obviously, I'm 26, so even when I was younger, obviously the 2000s, because I was born in 98, people were still going around and saying things like autism in women saying not very nice things about autism in women. Whereas nowadays, obviously, because of podcasts such as yourself, or because of writers such as myself, or because of really big advocates who go to places like the House of Parliament, like Toomey, we really are getting them. And I saw this, so there was a girl in that class as well who was dyslexic, and she was getting support that I didn't. For example, I was told by a teacher that I was stupid and wouldn't equate to anything when I was 10. A teacher wouldn't say that to a student now.
And in terms of you write articles, and I guess that does, to be able to have the authority to write articles around disability, I guess that's come from your own personal education about your own disabilities and stuff. What are the things that you write about, and does your articles helped people?
So obviously I mentioned I've most recently wrote one called I'm Not Just Lazy. And that's basically an anger piece from me, due to the fact that people are always saying you're not paying attention, you're just lazy, dyspraxia is not real, we're all quite clumsy sometimes. And it's a direct response to that. I've posted it in a lot of forums though, and everybody's really quite enjoyed it. And then also, obviously, that I said I've wrote my article on my autism called My Struggle to Accept My Autism. Again, that was received really well because the community said it was things they couldn't necessarily put into words themselves. I've wrote articles on, obviously, there's We Are Dyspraxic and We Are Sick of Your Judgment. Well, sick of judgment. Again, that's another one which is was brought about by annoyance and anger of the ignorance of the society. I've written a few pieces which are just my direct experiences. I wrote one about being a dyslexic at university. For example, some of them are more informational than others. I interviewed Hick Archer as well because I met him when I was 17. So I asked him if I could interview him and he said yes. I really enjoyed that as well.
And where did that interview get published?
Yes, it's on the Freshers website. I can send you all the links to all these things. I also, as I mentioned, fence competitively, which is not without its challenges. And I'm thinking about writing an article about my relationship to sport, and I'm thinking about calling it Always Last.
In terms of where you publish the articles, do you have a blog, or is it like where are the main places published?
I have a blog myself. It depends on where we'll take them. I used to be a freelance writer for Freshers, so I'd get paid for the articles. And they used to have some of them. This whole thing started with Red Britain newspaper, which is the student newspaper of the University of Birmingham. So they've got a couple of them. I've written for the Dyspraxia magazine. After the Dyspraxia Foundation closed, I had a lot to say about it, but I didn't have an outlet for it. So Sam Killop has his own blog, and he let me write on his blog about my thoughts about the Dyspraxia Foundation closing. I wrote an article for Dyslexia Scotland on my dyslexia.
And two areas of journalism are doing writing certain articles and such. What are the things that, in terms of your dyslexia and dyspraxia, are the things that could be challenges, and for those who want to maybe get involved in writing and such and getting published, what are the advice you would give to other dyslexics and dyspraxics who want to do this type of thing?
If you're interested in it, find a basically low cost and low stakes way to do it. So obviously I started with the student newspaper. Anyone who's at university can pick up a student newspaper. It might not be as established as the one I wrote for, but it should work. But writing as well, though, it's a talent. So either you're very good at it and you can hone it, or you're not very good at it. But if you're just writing for fun, then you don't really need to be that great at it. I started and I didn't think I was very good. And then everybody kept asking, oh, are you going to write some more? Are you going to write some more?
But a lot to fairness, I'll encourage some people that even if you might not think you could, I think it's something that if you have the interest in doing it, you can easily learn these things. And
a lot of people have their own blogs. See, as I've mentioned quite a few times, my friend Sam Killop, he has his own blog. But obviously, the problem with starting your own blog is you've then also got to promote your own blog. Whereas if you approach something like Dyslexia Scotland, it's established. They take stories. Dyspraxia magazine, she's always happy to have pictures, articles.
In terms of more, not just the getting published, but also of it, like how where it's like sometimes people might get like the negative perception that like with dyslexia courses can provide some of its own challenges. So what are the things that might be when you're writing? What are the things that might be challenging for you, or what are the things that you could people off in terms of if there are things that could help them proofread, anything that they could help them get published or get to improve on areas if they want. So what are the things that you might say to other dyslexic people who want to start writing and start getting published, but more from rather than the publisher, but the core writing element?
Just because you're dyslexic doesn't mean you're stupid or can't read or can't. So my husband thinks I'm rather funny because obviously I fence and I'm dyspraxic, and
Yeah.
I studied a bachelor's in history and a master's in warfare. Very written elements, but I did reasonably well on them. Sometimes about, if you have something to say, obviously you can sit and try to work it, but just, you don't always have to have obviously something to say. But so I don't write all the time because I haven't always got something to say.
Yeah.
But nobody needs to think as well, oh, nobody wants to hear this. Most of my articles have done very well. I didn't write them knowing they would do very well. But also, I see sometimes you don't have to sit and write it all in one. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you'll sit down and you'll write it and it will all come out. Sometimes it won't.
Yeah.
So it's your job. You don't need to sit down and do it. So don't fall.
I think what I'm just trying to hint at, of course, when you said that, like, sometimes there's the negative perceptions, it's not like something I was necessarily like trying to make the direct point of, but
Yeah.
I'm just trying to ask, is there anything that in terms of proofreading or anything that technically when you like writing on your computer, is there any software or anything can help you in terms of like spelling grammar or anything that can help you organise, or what are the more practical things of when you like type in? What is the things that
have any software? I just
yes
sit down and do it. I never wanted the software, never been interested. When I was shown it a couple of times, I didn't really care for it. But obviously, when you use something like Word, which I do use, in the corner it will tell you if there's grammar or spelling mistakes.
yeah.
It's also important to get somebody to read it over. So my husband often reads mine. I used to edit and proofread a friend of mine's work when he was at university because he's autistic, dyslexic, and dyspraxic as well. And I'm very good at editing, just not my own work. So, as I said, my husband used to check it, or a friend of mine, he was also studying a master's, he'd check my master's work as well. Well, I know there are things like Grammarly, but I've never really been interested.
Yeah, I think it's been good to highlight off what are the things that have helped you, or what kind of works for you. And I think just to get a broader picture of what are, like, in terms of like how your dyslexia affects you, or what are the kind of traits that you tend to have, and what are the things that past have been picked up on, and how does it normally affect you within your day-to-day life and such?
Patience is a big part of it. So obviously, as I mentioned, I competitively fence. I am the only female fencer who fences sabre at my club, Birmingham Fencing Club. I'm also the only disabled fencer who fences sabre. We used to have another
talking about how your dyslexia affects.
Dyslexia, yeah. When I did my bachelor's, I did my research for my dissertation on 21st century in remembrance like a year and a half before. Wouldn't sit and write it though. So I wrote it all in the space of about 2 days. I don't really recommend writing about 10,000 words in 2 days. It's not fun. But because I was becoming overwhelmed and was unable to break it into smaller chunks, I just would avoid it. And I don't recommend that. Whereas when I did my master's degree thesis, I was actually incredibly on top of it and was ahead of the schedule. The problem a lot of dyslexic people find is they'll only sit down and work when they like the topic.
Yeah, so
it's not the way the world works.
But in terms of the noticeable traits of when you were getting diagnosed and you had your assessment, what were the noticeable traits or the things that you were noticed to, that are because of your dyslexia?
Yeah, so obviously, I don't know if you've ever been to a lecture, but at lectures they just talk at you.
Dyslexic, lecture, yes, of course.
They just talk at you, don't they? And as a dyslexic, I couldn't take that information in. If I tried to type, I would get overwhelmed because by the time I was typing the first sentence, they were on the 10th sentence. So I had to talk to the lecturers and get them to, and we worked around another way. So I would go to the lectures, I would just sit there and listen, not type anything. And then they would give me notes at the end of the lecture. And for seminars, before, obviously, because I studied history, you just get massive blocks of text. So what I'd do is per question, so let's say there's 5 questions, I would make each answer a different colour so that it wasn't large blocks of black text. So I could see the difference and then I could read it and understand it.
So I guess it's a lot of it is like processing the information and like getting, because I guess even though like sometimes kind of write so like quickly or get things done, but I guess it's a lot in terms of concentration on the read, and maybe if you go back to rereading your own work, it's that process of actually making sense of it and actually being able to work with that big chunk of writing, is it?
Yeah, if I liked the topic, I wouldn't necessarily have any problems. But if I didn't like the topic, it was a lot harder. But in life, you're not always going to like it. So one thing my mother used to do with me is something I liked, then something I didn't like, and then something I liked again.
I haven't really had much of a conversation on the podcast on dyslexia, so can you tell me a bit more about what a dyslexia assessment can be like?
It's actually the same assessment. They were testing for dyslexia and dyspraxia in the same assessment. But it's things like, obviously, the standard one of read this text until I tell you to stop. I actually have a very high reading rate. But if you were then to say to me, can you repeat a lot of that back? Not necessarily, because I can read very fast. And when I was younger, I was actually hyperlexic, so I was reading books that were significantly older than my age, whereas most people think dyslexics can't read. Now, she says comprehension is still important and problem solving is still important. So we did some comprehension tests, some reading tests, some problem solving tests. As I said earlier, pictures. This is a picture. Make that picture with those blocks. They're looking at your core skills, basically.
Yeah, and I guess how you kind of repeat or export that information, you just import it into your brain.
And another one, obviously, is read this out loud, because then you need to read it, comprehend it, and say it.
Yeah.
Not all dyslexics can do that.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of dyslexics really wouldn't have liked at school when they would do joint class reading.
A lot of people, as you said, wouldn't think of hyperlex and dyslexia being something like one person could have. But what has been your experience of being both dyslexic, and what do people need to understand about how they can cross over?
I actually read Harry Potter assisted by my mother at 5, 6 years old. It wasn't read to me, I read it.
Yeah.
And when I was at school, when you were at school, obviously you would have those stage books. I never read them. I was always reading above my age. But the problem was sometimes I was bored, and sometimes I'd read books that were too easy for me because I was being lazy. And when I was 11, in 7, I had a literacy teacher, and he said to me, read The Hobbit. So I read The Hobbit, and I actually met a match there that would slow me down. I then tried to read The Hobbit and read The Lord of the Rings, and I couldn't. But see, and working with him was really good because he understood me, but I only had him the 1 year. Obviously, dyslexics, they don't really understand grammar and punctuation. Grammar and punctuation are not my friends at all. So my husband is always looking at my work and saying, no, that's not where commas go.
As you said about you, like you did after your course and you are a fencer, like people know that being dyspraxic can be like something, like sports not like an easy thing. So how did you get into doing fencing? And
So my first sport was actually karate. So between the ages of 9 and 12 or so, I did karate, and I was very good at it. I could have had my black belt by 16, but I was training 4 days a week and become rather quite bored, because it's a lot for somebody that young, so I gave that up. Then when I was 15, I got into archery. Me and archery, we had some difficulties. So it took me months and months to understand something, but I got a coach and he was understandable and I liked him. But when I went to university, it caused some problems because I wasn't very good, so other people would be quite rude to me. I used to coach for a while because I understood the principles, because at this point I'd been doing archery like 4 or 5 years. I just couldn't do them. But that made some of them say, who does she think she is? She doesn't know anything. But I actually got a gold medalist in the guy I coached at university competitions. So it proves they don't understood it, because a lot of people who are neurodivergent understand the principles perfectly fine. They just can't. Then I went to fencing when I was 22, 23 or so. Fenced foil for a year. Never really liked foil. But you have to start with foil to understand the basic principles. Because fencing, like, this is going to sound rather strange, but even the way you like walk in fencing is not how you normally walk. So you have to learn all of that. Then I picked up saber because I always wanted to fence saber anyway. I'm the only female and the Birmingham Fencing Club who fences sabre. I'm also the only disabled one who fences sabre. There used to be another person, but they left. But when I was being open about my dyspraxia, that made them also be more open about theirs, and they said they were really thankful for that. But it's difficult because not everybody always understands it. So sometimes I'll hit a bit too hard because my brain hasn't calculated that, and I don't know that is hard. Obviously, I know it's wrong to go around like hitting people really hard, but I don't know that hit I've just done is too hard. And sometimes people can be a bit mean to me about that. I tried to do my referee course and I failed because of largely a lack of confidence, which I am possibly going to go again next year. Luckily, I've got a coach who's rather understanding, so he knows the difference between can't do it and won't do it. And if I can't do it and I'm not getting it, he'll say, it's all right, let's move on. If I won't do it, he's no, we're going to keep doing it until you do it, which is really useful. And he's adapted things for me, like you're supposed to put the heel of your back foot behind the toe of your front foot. I said, not right behind you'd fall over, but in a squat, I can't do it, I'll fall over. So he adapted it slightly for me. It's difficult though, because obviously biologically I'm disadvantaged because I'm the only female who fences sabre. But then if you also throw in my disability, I'm essentially doubly disadvantaged. And me and fencing have a very much love-hate relationship. But I'm not looking to necessarily... I compete, which is no easy feat. Sometimes I'm doing... The last competition I was doing really well. Then I lost in the DE, which is the direct elimination, a fight that in principle I shouldn't have lost. It should have been perfectly fine for me, but I just couldn't do it. And it is obviously rather difficult. But plenty of people have said to me that things like my fencing has encouraged them to take up things that they didn't feel they could. Obviously, Girls Interrupting, they put out an interview with me because they contacted me because they were really interested in my sabre fencing. So they said they'd never met a dyspraxic sabre fencer, and I said, now you have. So they did an interview with me as well. People seem to be really fascinated by the fact I'm a dyspraxic fencer. So, Girls Interrupting on Instagram. So they do an interview because they said they'd never met a dyspraxic fencer, and I said, you have? People seem to be really fascinated by the fact I'm a fencer and dyspraxic. Plenty of people say, oh, I couldn't do it. But I normally train 2 times a week, but when it is really quite frustrating me, sometimes I leave it a little bit, give it some space, go back to it.
A long period of practice, and because it's something that to develop in the sport you may need to do a lot more practice and training than a person without. And of course it's hinting that there's moments of trial and error where sometimes for the better yourself, some days some things just don't go your way, and then there's some days like where you can really do it very well.
Because sometimes I understand the principles of it, but can I do it? And then you get really wound up by it. But I had to learn. I spoke to my coach about it though, and he says, 1, I'm disabled, and 2, I'm female. So I'm not going to beat the males at the club. I'm simply not. So when I learned to let that go, I was doing a lot better. But last month I was actually the women's sabre captain for the West Midlands team because we were fencing this thing called the Winton Cup, which is a competition for the regions and to fence each other.
Yeah, and when you mentioned about that, being a woman in this sport, you're like assigned as female above. What are the things that you imply that they are a disadvantage of?
So obviously, when I compete, I fence other women.
Yeah.
When my husband competes, he fences other men. Obviously, that's how it is in every sport. For training, obviously, you're all just mixed up. It's track, but I'm the only female. There are a few who come to try sabre every now and then, but sabre is my primary. In fact, sabre is my only. So I only fence sabre, which then leaves me in a pool of men effectively for training purposes. When your skill is more, you can. This is how my coach explained it to me, and my coach is a 2-time silver medalist for the Commonwealth Games. But he explained it to me as basically before skill, your biological, the way you're biologically made makes a difference in it. So obviously men have stronger lungs, men have stronger muscles, men have testosterone and things like that. So until a female is more skilled than a male based on the biological principles, it's hard to beat them. When you are more skilled, you can use your skill to beat biology effectively. That's the way the coach explained it to me.
In terms of I know in the Olympics there has been a lot of conversation around like a certain female boxer who is a second female at birth, but there's been challenges over her gender identity, which are untrue. So do you find sometimes there can be some gender negativity or gender discrimination of that? Like I guess the concerns about heightened transphobia within the sports community sometimes doesn't include for those women second at birth, female second at birth, when naturally got stereotypes of more masculine traits or
Obviously,
body.
I can't comment on trans because I was born female, but I can comment on female participation in sport because I've participated in more than a few sports.
Yeah.
Women's sabre has only been fenced in the Olympics since 2004. So this is the 5th Olympics to have women's sabre in it. Obviously, you'll also be aware that this is the first Olympics ever since the modern Olympics first came about in the 1870s to have equal participation. So 50-50. So sport is going along the way to be more inclusive for women, but it's still got a way to go. So you don't get it said too much, but I have had a few people say, really, female sabre fencer? That's not very feminine. But a lot of people aren't that bothered nowadays. It is going that way.
In terms of gender and disability diversity, what things do you think sport has got to improve for your experience, especially because you're experienced playing different sports like karate, what has been your sport can really improve on to be inclusive of both groups?
The problem in terms of disability in sport is obviously various disabilities there are disabilities that are categorized as disabilities by sport, and then they can do things like the Paralympics or Special Olympics, which is obviously for people who've got neurological conditions and things like that. But dyspraxia is not classified as a device. I understand that I don't necessarily need to fence somebody who's got a neurological condition because I haven't got one, but I'm not necessarily going to win the fight with somebody who's fully able, because I'm not fully able either.
Mm-hmm.
Dyspraxia in sport, it's odd. It exists in a space that's closer towards able-bodied, but then that disadvantages us. So I guess it would need some research, but I don't really know what you can do about it, because I suppose there's not enough people who are dyspraxic in, say, sabre fencing to give it a category. I'm not really sure where you go with that.
Do you think that there are things that are existing barriers for people who are dyspraxic and got other learning difficulties or other neurological conditions that might not be classified as a condition to be for somebody to be involved in the Paralympics, or as you referenced, the Special Olympics? Do you think that there are barriers there for people with disabilities like yourself participating in any sort of Olympics and major sports competitions? And do you think that there are like some things that do need to be reflected on and to encourage people to partake in sports?
I would say federation. So for me, that's the Fencing International. I can't remember exactly what it means. And the clubs, so for which is me, is Birmingham Fencing Club. And the teams you fence with, or this can apply to be any sport, obviously, can possibly, and obviously for me, it's British fencing and then English fencing as well, could possibly use obviously some more training and understanding. So obviously I have a coach who is patient with me. He's understanding. We have a bit of a laugh. He knows the difference between when I want to do it but can't, and can do it but won't, which is really good. But I have had coaches in the past within my three sports who've just not wanted to know and have not wanted to work with it. And they've said things like, you just don't want to, or that's not how that works. And you say, I know how it works. Thank you very much. I really want to get this thing, but it's going to take me a long time, maybe a year plus. But when I get it, I'll really get it. But obviously, dyspraxia isn't known about in society. When coaches and federations and boards and stuff do have disability training, I wouldn't say something like dyspraxia is on there.
So I guess it's I think there needs to be a culture to change the culture of the coaches referees and all the like that, or the federation, as you said, to get education and have some sort of information there for all trainers and coaches to be able to be using that information of to understand dyspraxic fences, and to be able to, for if anyone is fencing like yourself, maybe to learn from you, like your experience like your own, and so they can get that education. And I guess it's just also that having that cultural change to, yes, make dyspraxic people more enticed into trying sports and trying to fund activities like fencing and all that, not for it to be an intimidating experience. Sometimes having a disability or neurodivergent condition, they can be quite intimidating going into like a fencing gym of some sort and trying it for the first time.
Obviously, as you mentioned as well, you had a bad experience with PE, and mine
Yeah.
is similar. And as well, teaching PE teachers as well, that it's not really okay to let the other children be quite mean to this child who is different, is something good as well. Because obviously, when they have these bad experiences at school, they're often put off by sport for life.
As you said early on, you're interested in history. So can you tell me a bit about this interest of yours?
Yeah, so I do historical reenactment. So I do World War II. So I do the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. I do the ATS, which is the Auxiliary Territorial Service. And then I do Canadian. So I do the Canadian Women's Army Corps, which is the Canadian version of the ATS. And I used to do 1860s Victorian as well. I really like 1950s as well. So you'll have seen more than a few 1950s pictures on my Instagram as well. So I do amateur modelling mainly in the 1940s and the 1950s. And as you also mentioned, I do quite have an interest in history. So I write articles. So I've written a lot of articles for the Historians magazine, including my recent one on the ATS involvement in D-Day. I've got one coming out soon with the Historians magazine on the history of sabre fencing. I really do quite like history, have done since I was about 5. Since I was about 5, I say to my dad, can we go to the museum? And he says yes. But my sister, she didn't like the museum.
I asked you if had like any interest or knowledge of what type of like anything related to this disability history, or even though, like you said, you're more into the history of Victorians to wartime history. In terms of linking into the podcast and the sense of the theme of the podcast, what in terms of you might have learned from your interest in history about disabled people at the time, of the times that you were interested in understanding about history?
So I am possibly hoping to write something on the history of dyspraxia, because I put together a while ago on dyspraxia back when I was a youth champion for the foundation, and people seemed really shocked by some of the information. Because obviously dyspraxia has actually been known about since the 1930s, but it was called something else then. Obviously for a while it was called clumsy child syndrome, but they stopped that.
And as you said, you're interested in learning about the history of dyspraxia, but in terms of you, like, you have interest in history, is there anything that comes back to linking to what life might have been like for disabled people at the time, or anything that might be able to pick upon, really?
Yeah, so obviously I know do a lot to do with war. So obviously medical advancements happen quite a lot in war. Obviously as a result of World War II, medical advancement would have moved forward on things like skin grafts, aesthetics, because of obviously disfigured soldiers, because of the causes of World War II, and obviously the aftermath of fighting. And I do find that quite interesting, that there isn't really anything like war to drive medical advancements.
Is there anything that you haven't been able to say or that I think would be important to mention that you haven't already had a chance to say already?
Yes, obviously I'd say to anybody who has a neurodiverse condition, whatever it may be, negative things that people may have said about them bother them, and that if they're really interested in something, whether they're very good at it or not, to go for it. I'm pretty bad sabre fencer, but I enjoy it, so I do that. Because obviously modern society and commercialisation says we should only do things we're good at, and I don't personally believe in that. Also, obviously, if anybody is interested in writing and doesn't know where to start and wants help, I am on LinkedIn. If you type in Charis Hookley, I'm more than happy to talk to you.